What would you do if your own driveway, your private property, was suddenly declared community space by a neighbor who thought he could rewrite reality? I never imagined something as simple as my driveway would become the center of a battle for control, a war waged not with weapons, but with entitlement, deceit, and sheer audacity. It started with small, almost unnoticeable signs, footprints where there shouldn't have been any, a car parked too close to the edge, little inconveniences that felt like oversights rather than intentional acts. But then came the real bombshell. My neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, declared that my driveway wasn't actually mine. According to him, it was shared space, open for anyone in the neighborhood to use at will. I'd lived in my house for years without a single issue, but suddenly, I was being told that the ground leading up to my garage was no longer my own. At first, I laughed it off, assuming it was one of those absurd comments that people say just to stir up conversation. But the next morning, I stepped outside and found a car, one I didn't recognize, completely blocking my garage. Not slightly over the line. Not just close. Dead center. I knocked on Caldwell's door, expecting maybe an apology, maybe an, "Oh, let me move that." Instead, when he opened the door, he smirked. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Just amused. "Oh, that's my cousin's car," he said, waving a lazy hand toward my driveway. "He'll be back in a few hours." No big deal, right? It was a very big deal. I made it clear, he needed to move the car immediately. But Caldwell just crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "This isn't just your driveway, you know," he said smoothly. "It's been open for years. People have used it before. Just because you live here doesn't mean you get to hoard all the space." I felt my blood boil. My property deed, my title, every legal document I had, all of it proved without a doubt that this driveway was mine. And yet, he spoke with such unshakable confidence, as if my ownership was just a technicality, something he could talk his way around. Fine. If he wouldn't move the car, I would. I called a tow truck. If he wanted to play games, I was done playing nice. When the driver arrived, he took one look at the situation and nodded, preparing to hook the car up. But before he could even touch it, Caldwell stormed outside, yelling loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You have no right to tow community property," he shouted, stepping directly in front of the truck, arms spread wide, blocking the tow like some kind of martyr. The driver hesitated. "Sir, if this is private property." Caldwell cut him off. "It's not. It's been used by the neighborhood for years. If you tow that car, I'll sue." The tow driver looked at me, waiting for a call. I had to act fast. I pulled out my paperwork, shoved it in Caldwell's face. "This is private property," I stated firmly. "Your cousin's car is trespassing. I'm within my rights to have it removed." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, hesitation, doubt. But just as quickly, it was gone. He turned to the tow driver, voice dripping with false authority. "If you touch that car, you'll be dealing with the HOA." That was when I realized, this wasn't just about a car. This was the start of something much bigger. The battle over my driveway should have ended the moment I proved Caldwell was lying. I had the property deed, the legal documents, the indisputable evidence that the space in front of my garage was mine. But logic and facts didn't matter to him. And worse, they didn't seem to matter to the HOA either. In the days following our confrontation, I noticed a disturbing pattern. More and more cars began appearing in my driveway, as if some invisible line had been crossed, granting the entire neighborhood free reign over my property. At first, I thought it was just Caldwell being petty, maybe inviting a few friends to park there out of spite. But when I stepped outside one morning and saw a complete stranger sitting in a car parked in my driveway, scrolling through their phone as if they were in their own personal spot, I knew something bigger was at play. I knocked on the driver's window, and the guy barely glanced at me. Caldwell said it was fine, he muttered, his voice dripping with indifference. I didn't even bother responding. Instead, I stormed over to Caldwell's house and pounded on his door. This time, when he answered, he didn't smirk. He looked downright smug. "I don't know why you're so upset," he said, shrugging dramatically. "The HOA encourages shared spaces, you know. We're a community." I was beyond furious. I filed a complaint with the HOA that afternoon, expecting them to at least acknowledge that my property was being invaded. I sent emails, included photos, even attached a copy of my deed, highlighting in bold that my driveway was private property. But when the response came back, my blood ran cold. Karen, the HOA president, didn't just dismiss my concerns, she blamed me. Her email was polite, condescending, the kind of tone people use when they're telling you to shut up without actually saying it. "Ethan, while we appreciate your concerns, we must remind you that our community thrives on cooperation. Your behavior has been flagged as uncooperative, and your refusal to adapt to the needs of your neighbors is concerning." I had to read it twice to believe what I was seeing. Not only was the HOA refusing to help, but they were framing me as the problem. That same afternoon, a notice appeared in my mailbox. A fine from the HOA, for unauthorized modifications. I tore the letter open and felt rage pulse through my veins. They were fining me for the security cameras I had installed to document Caldwell's trespassing. The fine? $500. And the letter made it clear, if I didn't remove the cameras immediately, I'd be charged $500 per day until I complied. Caldwell was actively encouraging strangers to park in my driveway, and I was the one getting fined? I wasn't going to take this lying down. I took every ounce of evidence I had, photos of the cars, screenshots of the emails, the legal documents, and I printed them out. I walked straight into the HOA office and demanded to speak to Karen. She wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, she barely looked up from her desk when I entered. "I assume you're here about the fine," she said, flipping through a stack of papers, utterly unfazed. I slapped the evidence down in front of her. "I want this overturned," I said, barely controlling my temper. "My driveway is not public property. You're punishing the wrong person." She finally glanced up, eyes sharp and calculating. "Ethan, I think you're being a little dramatic," she said smoothly. "The cameras are making some of the residents uncomfortable." "The residents who are trespassing on my property?" I shot back. She sighed, shaking her head as if she was dealing with a stubborn child. "You have to understand, Caldwell has lived here longer than you. He's built relationships. The community trusts him." I stared at her, incredulous. She wasn't even pretending to be impartial. She was openly admitting that Caldwell was the favored neighbor, and I was the outsider who needed to fall in line. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "So what you're saying is, if I let people park in my driveway, this all goes away?" Karen smiled. She actually smiled. "I'm saying that cooperation makes everything easier. If you want to fight this, Ethan, you're welcome to. But HOA policies are enforceable, and fines add up fast." It was a threat. A blatant, shameless threat. I walked out of that office shaking with anger. This wasn't just about Caldwell anymore. This was about power. Karen and the HOA weren't just failing to help me, they were actively working against me, trying to pressure me into submission. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't going to bend. I wasn't going to compromise. I was going to fight back. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. If Caldwell and the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The first step was figuring out exactly how deep this conspiracy ran. Caldwell might have been the instigator, but Karen had made it clear she was more than just an enabler, she was actively working with him. I started gathering every piece of evidence I could. I compiled photos of the cars that had parked in my driveway, screenshots of my complaints to the HOA, and even recordings from my security cameras showing Caldwell directing people onto my property. I wanted to make sure that when I made my move, there wouldn't be a single loophole for them to wiggle out of. But then I stumbled onto something even worse. Late one night, as I was reviewing footage, I noticed a woman in a dark hoodie slipping a piece of paper under my doormat. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moment I saw what was on the paper, my stomach twisted. It was a petition. A neatly printed, official-looking document claiming that the community overwhelmingly supported shared driveway use and that I was the only one refusing to comply. It had nearly 24 signatures. Except, something wasn't right. I skimmed the names, recognizing a few of my neighbors, but when I checked against my records, I realized some of these names didn't even belong to real people. Others belonged to neighbors who had moved away years ago. The whole thing was a sham. Caldwell and Karen were trying to manufacture support, to make it seem like I was the unreasonable one. If I hadn't caught this, who knows what they would have done next. I took the petition straight to my next-door neighbor, Mark Hayes, a guy who mostly stayed out of drama but had always seemed level-headed. I showed him the names and asked if he'd ever signed anything like it. His face darkened. "Hell no," he muttered, shaking his head. "No one's asked me to sign anything." That was all the confirmation I needed. The HOA wasn't just ignoring the truth, they were fabricating lies to force their version of reality onto everyone else. It was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I drove straight to City Hall and met with a property official. I laid out everything, the petition, the fake signatures, the HOA's refusal to help. I even showed them the security footage of people trespassing in my driveway. The official listened patiently, flipping through my documents, and when I finished, he let out a sigh. "This is pretty serious," he admitted. "I can tell you right now that there's no legal basis for what they're claiming." He pulled up the official property records on his computer and turned the screen toward me. "Your property line is clear. No easements, no shared space agreements. This driveway is yours." I exhaled sharply, feeling vindicated. "Can I get that in writing?" 20 minutes later, I walked out of that office with an officially signed and notarized document proving that my driveway was 100% private property. Now, it was time to turn the tables. I scanned and printed multiple copies of the document, attaching it to the fake petition with a note that read, "This is the truth. The HOA is lying to you." Then, I started distributing them throughout the neighborhood. I stuck them on mailboxes. I slipped them under doors. I emailed every single homeowner I could find contact info for. I wanted everyone to see the evidence with their own eyes. The reaction was immediate. People started asking questions. Some reached out to me, furious that their names had been forged on the petition. Others simply started whispering among themselves, their trust in the HOA cracking. And then, the real breaking point came. That afternoon, I heard Caldwell yelling from across the street. When I stepped outside, I saw him storming toward the HOA office, waving one of my flyers in the air. He wasn't smug anymore. He was panicking. Because he knew. He had just lost control of the narrative. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching Caldwell storm across the street like a man on a mission. He clutched one of the flyers I had distributed, his face flushed with barely contained rage. I had expected him to lash out eventually, but this was desperation. He was losing control, and he knew it. Instead of confronting me directly, he marched straight into the HOA office. I couldn't hear what was said, but I didn't need to. Through the glass windows, I saw Karen's expression shift from annoyance to something far worse, worry. She snatched the flyer from his hands, scanned it, and then turned to her computer, frantically typing. They weren't just mad. They were scrambling. And that was exactly what I wanted. The fallout started within hours. Neighbors who had ignored me before suddenly wanted to talk. Some were outraged that their names had been used on the fake petition. Others admitted they had signed it but claimed they were pressured into it by Karen or Caldwell. But the best part? A few of them had saved their text messages and emails, concrete proof that the HOA had misled them into believing my driveway was public. That night, I compiled everything. The fake petition, the falsified signatures, the city's notarized confirmation of my property rights, and now, digital evidence proving HOA coercion. I wasn't just going after Caldwell anymore, I was going after Karen and the entire corrupt system that had let this nonsense continue. The next morning, I made my move. First, I scheduled a formal legal consultation to discuss HOA violations and possible civil actions. I wanted to know exactly how far I could push back. Second, I reached out to the local news. A small neighborhood dispute might not have been breaking news, but corruption in a homeowners association? That was a different story. I sent everything to a local investigative journalist, and by noon, I got an email back. "We'd love to discuss this further. Would you be open to an interview?" It was all falling into place. But I wasn't done yet. By the time Caldwell realized what was happening, it was already too late. The first blow came when I caught another car parked in my driveway. Unlike before, I didn't waste a second. I had multiple towing companies on standby, and this time, there was no hesitation. The tow truck arrived in minutes, hooked up the car, and before Caldwell could run outside screaming, it was already gone. He rushed over, red-faced and livid. "You can't just keep towing cars like this," he spat. I smiled, holding up the notarized document from City Hall. "Actually, I can. And I will." For the first time, Caldwell had nothing to say. No smug comeback. No fake legal jargon. Just silence. But then came the real tipping point. Later that evening, HOA called an emergency meeting. Caldwell and Karen must have thought they could control the narrative, spin things in their favor. But the moment I walked in, I saw the shift. The room wasn't filled with supportive neighbors. It was filled with angry ones. People who had been deceived. Homeowners who had received fines for bogus reasons, just like me. And sitting in the back was Mark Hayes, the first neutral neighbor who had finally seen the truth. When Karen cleared her throat to begin, someone cut her off immediately. "Why did you forge signatures on a fake petition?" She froze. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Why did you tell us his driveway was public when it's not?" More voices. More accusations. Karen's face paled as she tried to regain control. "Let's not turn this into an attack. The HOA has always had the community's best interests at heart. Then why did you try to extort money from Ethan?" A woman in the front row held up her phone, and I recognized the email. It was the bribe Karen had tried to offer me, demanding $2,000 to make the issue go away. Dead silence. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Caldwell, now suddenly realizing he was alone in this, started inching toward the exit. But before he could slip away, another voice stopped him. "You owe me $800 for that fence repair last year. You said HOA would cover it, but I never saw a dime." And just like that, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was everyone. One by one, years of HOA corruption unraveled in real time. Misused funds. Fake fines. Lies about property rules. By the time the meeting ended, there wasn't a single person left on Karen and Caldwell's side. HOA voted Karen out that night. Caldwell, now exposed for the liar he was, had no allies left. And when I walked out of that room, for the first time in weeks, I knew I had won. Caldwell might have lost the battle, but he wasn't the kind of man to go down gracefully. I knew that, and yet I still wasn't prepared for his last, desperate act of defiance. The night after the HOA meeting, I was woken up by a loud crashing noise outside. My gut twisted as I rushed to my front door. The moment I stepped out, I saw it. My parking barrier, the one I had installed after months of fighting for my property, was bent at an unnatural angle, tire marks skidding straight through it. Caldwell had rammed his car into it. I didn't even need to check the security cameras to know it was him, but when I did, the footage confirmed everything. There he was, in the dead of night, his headlights off, shoving his rusted old sedan into my barrier like some kind of tantrum-throwing child. He hadn't even tried to be subtle. He wanted me to see. He wanted to send one last message. But what he hadn't accounted for was that this wasn't just vandalism, it was a criminal offense. By sunrise, I had already filed a police report. The footage, the previous harassment complaints, the city's documentation of my property, all of it was stacked against him. The officers didn't hesitate. Caldwell was formally charged with trespassing, destruction of property, and harassment. 2 days later, a for sale sign appeared in his yard. The final blow didn't come from me, it came from the reality he had tried so hard to avoid. The HOA wanted him gone. His reputation was ruined, his influence shattered, and his bank account drained from mounting fines and legal fees. On the day he moved out, I stood on my porch and watched him load the last of his things into the moving truck. He didn't look at me. No parting words. No final smug remark. Just silent, seething defeat. And then, just like that, he was gone. The neighborhood felt different after that, lighter, quieter, peaceful. The new homeowners who replaced Caldwell were respectful and kind, the way neighbors should be. The tension that had poisoned the air for months was finally gone. But I had changed too. I had seen firsthand how entitlement and corruption can spiral into something much bigger than a simple parking dispute. How some people will twist reality, lie, manipulate, and push until they're forced to stop. I had learned that sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about keeping what's yours, it's about making sure people like Caldwell don't get away with it. So now, I have to ask, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or a Karen, in your neighborhood? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.